so much for joining us today for our Alumni Day in Putting the Garden to Bed. My name is Rachel and I work with the CSU Alumni Association, and I want to thank each and every one of you for spending some time with us today to learn about something educational and fun. You know, there's a lot going on in the world that's really challenging right now, and we hope this brings you some joy today. You are on a webinar, so your camera's off, you're muted, there's no need to worry, we can't see you eating lunch, so feel free to keep enjoying. But please go ahead and put in the chat, if you haven't yet, your name, your grad year, and where you're tuning in from. We always love to know where we have people watching us from. If you have any trouble with technology, feel free to privately chat me or let me know. And we will be sending out a recording of this event as well as the slides in a post-event email and survey, so definitely be looking out for that. So I actually have a surprise guest speaker with us today. We have Professor Jim Klett, and he is a wonderful professor who teaches landscape horticulture, ornamentals, and nursery management. And he's here to share a little bit about the CSU annual trial garden and perennial garden. So please feel free to put in the chat any questions you have for Jim. He's just here for a brief amount of time, but we thought it'd be fun for you to know about a beautiful garden on our campus and how they winterize that garden. So Jim, go ahead and take it away. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay, well, welcome. I'm glad to be here and to tell you a little about what we're doing here at our trial gardens. I hope that when you were on campus, or if you come back to campus, that you visit our trial gardens, which is now right directly across the street from the University Center for the Arts. We have been at that location now since 2000, and the garden has continued to grow each year. Some of you that are older graduates may remember that we had gardens over at our Plant Environmental Research Center at 630 West Lake Street, but that's where the canvas football stadium is now. The only thing left over in that site is the Arboretum, which is another beautiful site to walk through the 6 acres that are directly west. But today we're going to talk about the trial gardens and what we do in the fall. Well, this year we had a record number of varieties that were planted, close to about 1,100 different varieties. And they came from about 25 or so more companies from around the world, actually, either as seeds or as cuttings. And we have grown these, of course, starting when the end of May and all the way through. And most of you know that maybe last week this time, the weather really changed in Fort Collins. On September 8th, we went from a balmy 95 or so down to about 30, 32. So with annuals, we tried to protect as many of those as we could by running the irrigation system 24 hours a day to try to, because when water freezes or gets over it, it releases heat. And we were somewhat successful, but certain annuals are a lot more tender than others. Those of you that live up at the higher elevations know that. But we have some very tender annuals, and the ones that were hurt the most from this 32 that we got here in Fort Collins were like coleus, impatiens, marigolds, and zinnias. And looking at those yesterday, they became, they've got damage to them. But now there are some that are kind of half-hardy, like the petunias and the lantanas, and they look pretty good. And then we have hardy annuals that are like dianthus, both the carnation and the china pinks, violas, the brassicas, ornamental kale and cabbage, dusty millers. They look fine, and some of those would even stay through the winter. But these very tender annuals that we have, once they are totally basically frozen and turned brown, we will pull them out. And the university has a composting facility, and we compost everything that we take out of the garden. That way, that is then taken to the compost pile for the university. Now, I often get questions, can I take cuttings or could I take seeds from these plants before they freeze? Well, most of the plants are hybrids and they won't come true from seed. Plus, a lot of them are experimental plants, and our arrangement that we have with the 25 different companies is that, you know, we don't propagate or sell. We're basically evaluating these. And you can go to our website, flowertrials@colostate.edu, and learn about the best ofs and so forth that we had. And we just had our second evaluation day last Friday, so that information will be coming up on our website probably towards the end of this week with photos of our winners. Now, besides the annuals, which are basically a plant that's seed to seed, they die, but our perennial trials, which we have right across the street, right directly next to the University Center for the Arts, or also our perennial demonstration garden, which is directly to the north of the Center for the Arts. It's different. And there's kind of two trends of thought that you have with perennials. A lot of times it kind of depends on when you have labor available. Some people like to have a clean-cut garden in the fall and winter. However, in Colorado, of course, we can have often very open winters. And perennials are going to need some moisture often during the winter months that way. So given that, the trend might be to wait until like late February into March that way, that the plants, the perennials often will, the stems will collect some snow and so forth and kind of keep more moisture around those plants. Plus also a lot of them might have fruits or seed heads that would be nice for birds and wildlife. However, the drawback from that, sometimes the leaves and so forth that would accumulate could have diseases or harbor insect problems. So there's drawbacks both ways. What we do here is if we have a fairly good fall after a hard freeze, we'll probably cut back a lot of the perennials to a couple inches above the ground and try to clean up the beds that we wouldn't have so much work to do in March and April because you never know the type of weather. And if we have an extremely dry winter and not much snow cover, we will actually water those perennials some when the temperature is above 40, 45 degrees, because otherwise we may lose them just to really dry soil. And one of the other problems with perennials too is that when you have freezing and thawing of the soil, basically some perennials could heave out of the ground and the roots could be exposed, which could cause some damage. That's why some people just like to leave them that way and let the leaves and so forth that blow in gather. So there's two trends of thoughts that way. And if you're able to do some irrigation and so forth and have the time, and the fall is a pretty good time, a nice year that we have and we don't have early snows, then it might be wise to start cutting back some of those perennials. And that's what we try to do, but we end up generally doing a lot of that work in late February, March into early April when spring generally arrives. So those are some thoughts that I have here from our annual and perennial trials, and I want to make sure that all the alumni, if you get to Fort Collins, be sure to visit. There's still a lot to see this fall, even in the annual garden and the perennials, of course, often with the ornamental grasses and so forth that we have, that we let through the winter, are quite nice to see at any month of the year. So I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was super interesting, and I can attest, I was just at the garden a couple weeks ago and it is still blooming and beautiful, so I highly recommend checking it out. Does anyone have any questions for Professor Klett on the annual trial garden or the perennial garden? This is definitely an exclusive access to ask those questions. So please put them in the chat now if you have them while we have Jim here with us still. I would say, Jim, I do have a question personally.
Sure.
How many people does it take to kind of prepare the garden every year?
Well, currently I just have essentially the 3 undergraduate students that work there. And due to COVID and so forth this year, we weren't able to get many volunteers. We often have master gardeners that help. So it's going to be basically up to our 3 work study students to help to clean the the annual garden. The perennial garden, we have 2 people, 2 or 3 near undergraduate students working 10, 12 hours a week. So it's going to take a while.
That's awesome. It looks like Diana is wondering how you would approach how would your approach differ in different parts of the country or zones? Have you ever thought about what your trial annual garden might look like if you did it somewhere else, not in Colorado?
Yeah, well, true. This is in Colorado, of course, for annuals where we have a freeze, they die. If you're in other parts of the country, California or so forth, maybe southern Texas, they may plant annuals 3 times a year. They'll have an early spring, a summer, and a fall, just that people get tired of looking at the same things. Here in Colorado, we just basically have 2 seasons. We'll put cool seasons out in October, violas and pansies, and maybe this year we got some flowering kale and cabbage or primroses and so forth. So it's going to vary, and that would be true also for the perennials, because of course in some areas perennials could be alive really all 12 months of the year with some bloom on it. You just deadhead them and go forth with that to keep continual bloom on them when it gets below freezing here.
That's awesome.
Hopefully that answered it.
Thanks. We have another one about the trial garden specifically. Kimberly is wondering if the trial gardens are associated with the Spring Creek gardens and their plant cell.
The gardens that we have at the CSU are trial gardens, and it is separate from the gardens at Spring Creek. But the Spring Creek plant sale, we have some of our students in our horticulture program grow some of the plants in our greenhouses for that Mother's Day plant sale. But they are not ones that go to the trial garden. It's a class that grows some, and then I believe also Front Range Community College grows some, and also the gardens at Spring Creek. Generally, what our students are growing are the flowering annuals, and I think the gardens at Spring Creek grows more vegetables and so forth.
Awesome, thank you. We have another one that's particular to the trial gardens. For all of you that are asking more broad annual perennial soil questions, Sherie will go over that next in our presentation, but thanks for putting those questions in there now. But this one for you, Professor Klett, is what happens with the vegetables grown in the trial gardens?
Well, again, the vegetables that are grown in the trial, we don't have many. And this year there was a little trial of tomatoes from master gardeners, and they were harvesting them to get some quantity of what were produced on those varieties. The other plants, since we overhead irrigate with some fertilizer in the water, I'm a little hesitant with that. But some of the students, for instance, that work there aren't that many. I let them take them home that way. And we get some pilferage too, I'm sure. So, but there aren't that many.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. If anyone has any last questions, this is your time for the trial garden or perennial garden. We'll get to those specific questions about your planting next. But Professor Klett, this has been really fun, and thank you so much. I've learned a little bit more myself, and I definitely appreciate it. Okay, we do have one more question that I think is an interesting one, and then we'll let you go, Jim. But someone is wondering if the massive growth at the gardens depends on the fertilizers that you're using.
Well, the fertilizer at the trial gardens, this is the annual trial gardens, we put a slow release fertilizer down after they're planted, which is very similar to what you can purchase from a homeowner. It's a resin coated Osmocote. It's sold for homeowners. Then we do put some liquid feed down, basically in the irrigation system, generally maybe twice a week, just like what you would use with Miracle Grow at home. And it goes through our irrigation system. And I should say, the irrigation system out there is all non-potable water
That's
that we
awesome.
use too. So that would be another question about harvesting the fruit using that non-potable water on all the plants.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you jumping on I thought it'd be a fun way for us to kick off this webinar about putting the garden to bed, because you obviously have a lot that you do every year with the beautiful annual trial gardens and perennial gardens. So thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that your semester continues to go well in this virtual atmosphere, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye now.
All right, everyone. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our other guest speaker today, who's going to be presenting about some really applicable ways for you to put your garden to bed at home. I have with me today CSU Pueblo County Extension Agent Sherie Shaffer. Sherie is a wealth of knowledge in all things horticulture and absolutely loves playing with her dogs and her really adorable son, and is very happy to be here with you today. I totally just shortened your bio, Sherie, to get your presentation going. So I will go ahead and let you take it away. Please continue to add to the chat any questions you may have for Sherie as she gets going.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So yeah, I did take a browse through some of the questions that came in on the chat. I think I will cover a lot of those in the presentation. But, you know, feel free if there's something I don't cover to pop those in the chat, and I will definitely get to them at the end here. So now, you know, we get to starting to get a little bit cooler. A lot of people think the work in the garden is over, but there's a lot of stuff that you can do in the fall, particularly stuff you can do to prepare for not only the coming winter, but to kind of get a head start on next spring. There's a lot of planning and improvement you can do. You know, if you have a new area you're going to be planning that out, or maybe something just didn't quite work out well this year, maybe plans for improvement. Those are all things you can start thinking about now in the fall. Cleaning up and winterization we'll definitely cover. There's a lot of like those kind of just little chores that need to get done. And then there are a lot of things that can be planted, particularly down here in southern Colorado, but you know, all over there's still some stuff you can get planted now. So I'm just gonna I gave you like a little list that we're gonna go through, and you will get these slides, so you'll have this list that you can refer back to. So the first thing I want to touch on is mulch. It's a really great time to get things mulched. If you already had mulch, to kind of renew that for the winter. Mulch is great. It's going to stabilize your soil temperature and your soil moisture. So like Dr. Klett was saying, how frost can cause the roots to heave up and they can be damaged when they're exposed. The mulching will help to prevent that a little bit. And especially, I saw somebody ask about newly planted perennials. You'll definitely want to mulch those because they are even more susceptible to root damage when they're new. So definitely you want to mulch. Another question that I saw in the chat is things that you can do now to improve your soil for next year. Mulching is that's another function of mulching. And you'll want to choose an organic mulch for that situation. So by that I mean something that's going to break down, like grass clippings. Of course, make sure there's no chemicals on them, especially if you're using them in a vegetable garden, but things like straw, even eventually bark chips will break down. They'll be a lot slower than your grass clippings or your straw. But adding those mulches now will help your soil in the long run, not only by keeping it covered and allowing the microorganisms in the soil to thrive, but when spring comes, you can kind of till those under and incorporate them into the soil and add organic matter to your soil, which can really help bust up some of that clay that I know we all deal with in our gardens. If you have areas that you have annuals planted, also like temporary organic mulches are good. Something that, you know, it's not going to last forever, so you can kind of play with which annuals you plant from year to year. If you have perennial areas, you can have a more permanent mulch, especially if you have very like xeric, heat tolerant plants. That's when you might want to go with like a gravel mulch or something that will stay there. And we have a really great fact sheet that I have linked here. And you will get these slides, so you'll have this link. But this is a fact sheet called Mulches for Home Grounds. And it kind of goes over a lot of different options for mulches and in what situations you would use them. So that's a really good fact sheet to check out if you want to learn a little bit more about mulch. Saving seed is another thing that you can do now in the fall. So you can save seeds from fruit, veggies, flowers, things that you really liked in your garden and you want to grow again. So reasons you might want to save seed is that you save money. You don't have to buy that seed again. The seed that you save, once you plant it year after year after year, those plants actually become acclimated to your soil and your climate and the area that they're planted in, and they'll start to thrive more and more and more each year. So, you know, you also control the different qualities that you see. So if you save seeds from your first early big juicy tomatoes that you had, that's going to tend to give you those early producing qualities again. So, you know, you can choose, like, I really love the quality of this tomato, so I'm going to save seed from it. You do need to kind of be aware of, like Dr. Klett was mentioning, hybrids don't really come true to seed. Their seed don't come true to form. You need to have a more open pollinated variety. And again, I have a fact sheet linked here that will go into that. You want to know about the pollination methods so you can keep things separate if you don't want hybridization. But you know, if you want to just very simply just give it a try and see what you get, definitely try to save some seed from plants that you like. You can always call your local extension office and get some help on where that seed is formed on the plant and things like that, and definitely check out this fact sheet. But saving seed is becoming pretty popular in the more recent years, and it's a pretty fun thing to do. Now, Dr. Klett did touch on this, cutting back perennials. You can absolutely do it in the fall. I like to do it in the late winter, early spring, like Dr. Klett was saying, to provide some shelter and some forage for beneficial insects and wildlife that are around during the winter. So whenever you do decide, it's a personal preference, absolutely. Whenever you do decide to cut back your perennials, you'll want to cut them back 2 to 4 inches from the soil surface. Anything that has any kind of disease or insect problems during the growing season, you don't want to compost that. Just go ahead and throw those away. But if you have healthy plant parts, those can absolutely be composted. Any sections of your perennial areas that are kind of getting overgrown and too crowded, you can divide those. So, you know, a lot of times we need to divide our irises and things like that, and they're great gifts for your neighbors. So you can divide and replant or give them away. And then, of course, you mulch and winter watering is enormously important for perennials, lawns, trees. Our winters can be pretty dry. So any water that you can give your plants when it's been dry for a few weeks is really great. You know, wait for a few warmer days and give them some water. They'll really show improvement next spring. And the fact sheet I have linked here is a very general fact sheet, which I believe Dr. Klett is the author of, just on perennial gardening. And it's really just kind of a little one-stop shop if you're new to perennial gardening. It's really nice. I do believe it has a plant list as well. There's a lot of really good plant lists on the CSU Extension website. Wrapping sensitive plants. So if you have a woody perennial or a newly planted young tree, particularly if it's a thin-barked tree, it will probably benefit from being wrapped. If you had some bark peeling issues this year, you might want to wrap over the winter. So typically we wrap in November and we remove the wrap in April. You don't want to leave it on all year. That tends to give you more problems like insects and things like that will hide underneath the wrap. So, you know, we wrap at Veterans Day, remove on tax day, if that's easier to remember for you. This is going to help protect your young, sensitive, woody plants from sun scald, which is something that happens in the winter when the bark warms up suddenly, and frost cracks, which is a similar injury. Also, hungry wildlife foraging throughout the winter. This will kind of deter them from munching on your trees. And this link here will go very deeply into wrapping trees, what you should use, when you should do it, why you would do it. So if you think you might need to wrap your trees, I would definitely suggest checking out this link. This is one of our garden notes that our master gardeners would use to become trained. So it's very thorough and a very great publication if you need to learn more about wrapping. Removing plants. If you have annuals that have finished blooming, you can go ahead and remove those and compost them if they're disease-free. Any kind of diseased plants, this would be a great time to get them out of the garden and just dispose of them so that problem doesn't become worse next year. If you have summer blooming bulbs and corms, you can dig them up around the fall time before the tops, or when the tops start to die down before the soil freezes. Dig them up, store them in your garage or somewhere like that, maybe in some peat moss, and you can replant them next spring. Tender vegetable plants that aren't going to survive the winter, those can be removed from your garden and composted. Do consider crop rotation when you're removing your plants. A lot of times if we keep planting one kind of crop in the same place year after year after year, we start to run into some disease issues. So it's good to move different plants to different areas of your garden year after year so that you don't just have, tomatoes in the same place every year. Hardy crops can stay in the ground. So, like parsnips and some really hardy things like that, they can stay in, mulch them so that they're protected and they'll stay moist. And we do have a couple of links here. So the first one here is the vegetable planting guide, which will kind of go over which vegetables are hardy, which are tender, which might survive a little bit of frost, which absolutely will not. So that's a really good fact sheet for you. And then the second link there is just a little plant talk script on growing cool season vegetables. So just some kind of tips on how to keep them in the ground a little bit longer, which ones you might be able to keep, and just some tips on those kind of things. Amending your soil. It's a really great time to start thinking about amending your soil for next spring. If possible, it's a really good idea to get a soil test, because especially if you're having issues and you haven't been able to figure out these issues and you think they might be soil-based, the only way to really know what's going on with your soil is to get a test. So call your extension office in your county. We have kits that you can take, and they have instructions on how to gather a soil test. And then you can actually mail that kit to the lab at CSU, and it's a really good test. They'll give you specific recommendations for your situation, and then you can figure out exactly what you need to do to your soil to make it work for your specific situation. It's always good to add some compost and organic matter. Plant-based compost is best. If you want to apply a manure-based compost, you definitely don't want to do that in the spring. You'll want to do that in the fall so that it has time to break down and kind of decompose, so you don't get any issues with E. coli or anything like that. I will caution you that manure-based compost and things like that can be a little salty and make your soil have a little bit of a salt accumulation, so do be aware of that. Organic mulches, which we already talked about, are great to add in the fall and let them kind of break down over winter, and then you can always till them in or not next spring. And cover crops. There are plants that you can plant that will grow over the winter, and then you can till them in when spring comes, and it's almost like a green manure. It adds the nitrogen and the nutrients to your soil. It kind of mulches at the same time. So things like winter rye, and there's different legumes that you can plant. That's a really good idea to do, especially if you have like a vegetable garden bed or something like that. And again, a couple links here for further reading. choosing a soil amendment, we'll go over things like compost and manure and things like that. And then another garden notes here on, I believe this one is on the using the cover crops in your garden. Fall and winter watering. I really can't stress enough how important this is. All perennials, and that means, you know, your flowering perennials, that means your lawns, that means your trees. They all will really, really thank you when it's really hot next summer and they're starting to struggle. They'll really thank you for watering them during the fall and winter. And, you know, when we have, for the last couple years, we've had a very sudden, very extreme temperature drop in the early fall. You know, we just had it a couple weeks ago, so it's fresh in our mind. And when that happens, it really does some damage to the trees. They're probably not hardened off yet, so they're still, you know, liquid inside of their inner systems. And then when we get that freeze, it can freeze that liquid and burst those systems. So you might not notice now any kind of damage, and you might not even notice next spring. They'll probably leaf out. But then when it gets really hot next summer, that's when we start to see, like, what is going on with my trees? They're not doing well. I'm seeing dieback. They're declining. And that's why, because they have that damage in the fall from that sudden freeze. And then once it gets really hot and they're really needing all systems go, they start to suffer. So if we're able to do some fall and winter watering, that will help them to have a head start on overcoming some of that stuff that happened in the fall, so that they'll be good next summer. So kind of the general rule, there is a fact sheet here that goes over fall and winter watering in depth. I would absolutely suggest taking a peek at it. But you want to wait until we're going to have a few nice days in a row. Dr. Klett mentioned waiting until it's going to be about 40, 45, down here in southern Colorado, 50, 55 degrees we even get sometimes. You know, and we want to have a few nice days in a row. And, you know, go ahead and give your plants some water midday so the water can soak down before it gets real cold at night. Maybe you want to do it about every month or so if we haven't had really good moisture, maybe every 3 weeks if it's been real dry. Drag your hose out, drag the bucket out, do whatever you can to get some water to those roots, and your plants will be very, very happy with you for doing it. Fall lawn care, aerating, core aerating, especially if you have lawn issues. You can also do that in the spring, or you can do both. It's a really good thing to do to kind of introduce some oxygen into your soil and to create some relief from any compaction that's been going on. So core aerating is really great for your lawn, and it's a great time to do it. You can still do a fertilization while your grass is still green, which I'm sure most of the cool season lawns are. And don't forget to winterize your sprinkler system. You know, you'll want to get that blown out before we get really, really hard freezes going on, so you don't have burst lines come next spring. And then if you do need to do any overseeding, you can actually do that in September. It's a really good time to do it. And that goes really well with the core aeration. So you do the aeration, you have those holes in your lawn, and then there's somewhere for the seed to actually go and contact the soil, and you'll get a lot better germination rates. So do the aeration, overseed any bare patches, keep them real moist until you start to see them sprout, and then you can kind of start to water less frequently, but with more water until you have to shut your system off for the winter. And then just start back up over the when springtime comes. Fall planting. There's a lot of stuff that can still be planted. Most fall vegetables probably needed to be in by now. There are some very, very short season radishes that have a really short days to maturity. You might be able to still plant some of those. We're getting pretty late though for vegetables. But perennials can be planted a month before the first frost, which typically occurs around October. So you've got a little bit of time to get some perennials in. You can plant your garlic in early October, and then you can plan to harvest that fall planted garlic in June. And don't forget to mulch it and keep it a little bit moist over the off season. Spring blooming bulbs like tulips, daffodils, crocus, things like that can be planted in late September. Again, mulch and water. If you have areas that you plan to plant early next spring, it's a really good time to prep those, get them ready for next spring, do some amending so they'll be ready to go and you can just have fun when it comes springtime and get your flowers planted. And again, like I said, can't stress enough that mulch and water. So I do have some fact sheets linked here on one on fall planted bulbs. So, you know, how deep, which ones are good for fall planting, and then another link on planting garlic. Season extension. So sometimes we're just not quite ready to let go of that vegetable garden. I know I sure wasn't a couple weeks ago when I saw we were going to have a freeze. So there's things you can do to extend your season, absolutely. And we have an amazing publication on it, which of course is linked right there with tons of good ideas. But just to kind of run down what you'll find in that publication, basically you want to cover stuff when we're going to have a freeze. So a lot of you probably did that when we had that freeze a couple weeks ago. You know, very simply, sheets, blankets, tarps, that will do pretty well. I covered my vegetable garden with just like a regular old tarp and it survived. So that will definitely help. Fabric or plastic row covers are another option. If you want to start getting some real good frost protection, you might look into space blankets. They will give you a lot of protection from the frost. And then you can start combining your space blankets with like those kind of old bulb Christmas lights. And that will really warm the inside of those plants overnight. You will usually want to remove those coverings during the day to kind of recharge the soil with the sunlight. And, you know, because it still might get a little bit hot during the day when the sun's out. So you don't want to bake your plants if they are covered with like clear plastic or something like that. So do remove the coverings during the day, keep them covered at night. And then there's this neat invention called a wall of water, which I have a photo here. So if you have this is kind of more applicable to a springtime, like getting an early start. Because if you have a really big plant, the walls of water aren't large enough to cover the whole thing, usually. But if you have a small plant, this would absolutely be fine in the fall. And what it is you put it around your plant. It's a little plastic structure thing, and it has these little tubes that you fill with water, and it's kind of chemistry in action. As the water freezes, it will release heat, and it will kind of keep that little plant warm. So it gives you a little bit of protection from any kind of cold temperatures. And like I said, tons of really good ideas on season extension at this link that's here. There's a lot of just chores to do in the fall as well. If you have a rain barrel or any kind of outdoor containers like that, you'll want to empty them before it starts to get real cold. Store them upside down. Make sure, you know, your valves are at least a little bit open so that they don't freeze and burst. Drain your hoses. You don't want to have a burst hose. Store them in the garage or something like that once they're dry. If you have fall leaves, those are really good to mulch. If they're in your lawn, it's actually really good to just go ahead and mow over them with a lawnmower, and it'll create kind of a little mulch for your lawn area. And I mean, that's easier than raking and picking them up. So it's also good if you're kind of a lazy gardener. So mulch those right onto your lawns. If you're raking them up from other garden areas, you can absolutely use those for a mulch, you know, in another garden area. They're great. They shouldn't just be thrown away. When I see big bags of leaves being thrown away, I'm like, oh man, I should go get those. Any kind of power equipment, you know, winterize it, take care of the fuel situation, stuff like that. Any kind of tools should be cleaned, dried, and stored over the winter. So this is kind of just the final checklist of everything we just went over, so that when you get these slides, you can just look and say, okay, have I handled all the stuff that I can do this fall in my garden? And this is just kind of the final little check to see. So that's the presentation, and I'm sure that there are questions. Pull up the chat here. There's the chat. Let's see here. Is soil and planters changed completely each year? That's a good question. It kind of depends. If you didn't have any really like insect or disease problems, you can definitely still use that soil. You might want to add a little bit of compost or maybe some slow release fertilizer just to kind of recharge it for the next year. But you can a lot of times definitely reuse that soil. Any kind of issues, if you had any kind of issues with that plant though, I wouldn't. I would start fresh and I would absolutely rinse, like clean the container well.
One of the earlier questions, Sherie, was someone asked, they recently moved into a new home and they were wondering if there was a way to tell what plants are annuals and what plants are perennials.
Yeah, so I mean, the easiest way to tell is going to be like if they come back next spring, they're perennial. If they die, they don't come back, they're an annual. But that would definitely be something that your master gardeners or your local county extension agent can help you to figure out, especially if you know the name of the plant. You know, you can call and say, hey, is this going to come back? Do I need to mulch it and stuff like that? If you're not sure what it is, another thing, your county extension agent can help you to ID that plant. So it kind of just takes a little bit of research or trial and error to wait and see if it actually will overwinter in this area. Let's see here. When should cover crops be planted? Nowish. You know, you want to plant them right about now, as soon as your gardens, your vegetable garden's kind of done. I know a lot of them are still kind of going. They survived that early frost. But once they're done, you can go ahead, clean out your garden, get those cover crops planted in, you know, fall, mid to late fall. I'd say they need to be planted. And can herbicides be used in the fall on lawns? It depends, unfortunately. It depends on the product you're using, the weeds that you're using them on. But if you read the label of the product, it will tell you when it should be used. And then, you know, be sure that you know what you're using and you don't put those on your vegetable garden or something like that. But yeah, there's definitely some situations where an herbicide would be used. Even like a weed and feed maybe could be used. Any specific recommendations for roses? I would say mulch them, absolutely, of course. Fall and winter watering, of course, a broken record there. You can usually wait to prune them if you'd like to until, you know, late winter time if they need pruned. If they're newer, they might not need it. We have a really good fact sheet on roses too on the CSU Extension website that it goes over care of roses for Colorado gardeners, and it's really great. So I would suggest to take that out. Should I consider tilling my vegetable garden in the fall to incorporate manure or other organic matter? That one is kind of a debatable topic. Again, some people are strictly no-till, and there's really good thoughts behind the no-till, because you know when you till, you start to disturb the microorganisms and all of the plant life and activity that's going on in your soil. That being said, sometimes your soil is, you know, like somebody mentioned, they have that heavy clay. Sometimes you gotta till that, or there's just no way you're gonna get anything planted in there. So, you know, I'd say if you need to incorporate some organic matter, some manure, things like that, the lighter you can till, the better. Typically, you want to mix that down at least a few inches, and it's fine. It is fine to till, but I also think there are benefits to a more no-till kind of situation. And fall's a really good time to top dress and just let it kind of break down. So they both could work. Let's see, I have lots of leaves at my house. I put the leaves on my vegetable garden, but I always wonder how many inches of leaves is too much. 5 inches, 10 inches, how much might be too much? That's a really good question, because too much can start to, they might kind of mat together and cause a layer where no oxygen is getting through. And we forget sometimes, you know, we know the plants need water, but we forget sometimes that roots also need oxygen. So that's a really good question. 10 inches is absolutely too much. I'd say 5 inches, 2 to 3, 4, that's probably the sweet spot. 5 would probably be fine if they're not getting real matted together and you don't put them on real wet. I probably wouldn't go too much over 5, definitely. What is the best product to use for indoor plants you are bringing in for the winter, specifically to treat for critters? You know, if we're talking like like fungus gnats that's kind of a problem in those indoor plants. And something you can do that's really easy and works really well is they make these sticky like pieces of cardboard, and they're yellow, and you would hang them near the plants, and those gnats will just be attracted to it and they'll stick to it, and they work really well. There's one on my window right there for my house.
I love those too. I use those as well, Sherie. I also read for bringing outdoor plants in, sometimes spraying them down with like neem oil. Was that something you would suggest for before bringing them inside?
Totally. Neem's a great product, and that'll take care of a lot of those things that sometimes come inside, like fire mites and the gnats and all those kind of things. So yeah, like a neem oil would be a pretty general thing. Just be cautious about doing the neem and then having them in the sunlight. It can tend to burn, but you know, read the label, always follow the label instructions, and that should be fine. You don't want to, when you bring them in, you don't want to keep them super soggy either. That will tend to cause more problems for you. So let's see. I think I got them all in the chat, but did a couple come in the Q&A? Let's see. I'm having a late crop of aphids. Kill or leave? Oh, that's a hard one. Aphids are, you know, if you jet them off with like a really strong jet of water, that usually takes care of them. Aphids are kind of weak, and if you get a really good jet of water, that'll usually get rid of them. You know, they're pretty good forage for some of those beneficial insects too. So a lot of times I don't really suggest to like spray anything on aphids because they are so weak and there are so many natural predators that they usually will handle it. And it's so late that, you know, it's not like it's going to kill your garden for the whole year. It's almost over anyway. I would personally, if it were my garden, I'd probably leave it. What tricks do you have for keeping leaves that are used for mulch in place? My neighbors don't even come in here. That's true. That could be a hard one. They might blow away. Yeah, that is a hard one. We have that problem down here. It gets super windy in the prairies with any kind of organic mulch, like straw or anything will just blow away. I mean, you can kind of try to use some like edging. If you wet them down and maybe kind of like do a light tilling with them, that could help. But that one is kind of hard to prevent if they're blown away. Is it okay to add compost to raised beds in the fall that isn't completely broken down yet? In the fall, I would say yes. Yes, it is okay. You know, you probably want them to be started at least, the breaking down process to be started. But yeah, you know, you can add compost and manure that still needs to go in the fall. I wouldn't add it in the spring. Is there anything we can use to deter rabbits from eating our grass? No, you guys have some real good questions there. Not real. I mean, other than completely like physical barriers that wouldn't allow them in, there's not really like a product. They do have like predator urines that you can use that will sometimes keep them away a little bit, but eventually they'll catch on to you and realize that that predator isn't actually there. So you might try something like that, but there's not really a whole lot you can do for those little critters, unfortunately.
Speaking of things that eat plants outside, we've got a question on keeping grasshoppers from feasting plants. I can relate to this question. That has been my whole entire last few months, is these dang grasshoppers.
Yeah, they can be bad, especially when we have a bad year. There are products you can use, and you just have to kind of be careful. If you're using it on like an edible garden, your options are a lot less than if they're eating your ornamentals. But there are products that can be used in the vegetable garden. The one that comes to mind is 7 is the brand name. And you know, you just want to be super careful about how long you have to wait before you would harvest anything and things like that. If it's your ornamentals, you have a ton more options. And another really good fact sheet on the CSU Extension website is the grasshopper control fact sheet. But I will just say there's a bait, and it's like a biological control option. So it's I think like a protozoa that is in the bait. The grasshoppers come and eat the bait, and then it basically prevents them from being able to grow. So it will kill them, but it won't hurt. You know, if like a bird were to come eat the grasshopper after that, they'd be fine. It won't hurt anything else. It's really environmentally friendly. So checking out those baits. I think the 2 brand names are Nolo Bait and Semaspore. They can be a little bit hard to find and a little bit pricey, but they're really good options. And with grasshoppers, you got to start early. You got to get them while they're small. They're so much easier to control. Once they get big, they become a little bit harder. Chain link fence squares work for my raised beds. I'm thinking we're talking about rabbits there. So yeah, like physical barriers, if possible, are the best. Absolutely.
I did see it.
Yeah. Got it. I just saw it in the other chat box. That's genius. To kind of net, even with like a chicken wire or something. Fantastic idea.
There was one question very early on that I feel like we've maybe touched on, but let's revisit it just in case. Someone was wondering if for brand new perennials that they've planted, if there's anything extra special they should be doing to take care of them.
Well, you know, you definitely want to mulch them. Keep them mulched in whatever mulch you choose to use, but you definitely want to mulch them. You definitely want to keep watering them over the fall and winter. I know I've said that a lot of times. One thing I would not do is you definitely don't want to do any kind of like fertilizing now. We want them to start getting that signal like, okay, fall, it's time to go to sleep for the off season. And if you were to fertilize now, that would kind of trick them into thinking that it's still the growing season. So no fertilizer, mulch, water, you should be good. And then if we do get a heavy snow, you know, knock them off any branches if you choose not to cut back until later on or earlier next year, so they don't get damaged. Have I missed any other questions? I think I got them all.
It looks like there's a new one in the Q&A section that asks if you could put a light layer of garden soil over mulch to help hold it down.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great idea. You can, awesome. You can definitely do that. And, you know, don't forget about like compost as a mulch. You know, you don't always have to till it in. You can put that compost just right on top and it works as a great mulch, and it'll kind of give you a light amount of fertilization over to kind of be there next spring when you're ready for it.
Awesome. This is all super helpful. I definitely know I need to get my garden ready for winter too, so I'll be using these tips. We will be sending out this PowerPoint presentation as well as the video recording to any of you who have participated, as well as a survey. So if you would like to be connected directly to your local CSU extension agent, you can click that on there, and I'm happy to make an introduction. I know Sherie has, I believe, your contact information on the next slide. So you can bother her directly if you have more questions, and if you are local in Pueblo, of course. But if you have any other questions, we can stick around for another minute or two, but I think we've had a lot of awesome questions. Thank you everyone for being so engaging. Sherie, do you have any last words for us today?
Just, you know, even if you're not from Pueblo County, you can still reach out, and if it seems like something that's more regional, I can definitely connect you to your horticulture agent in your region. Happy to take emails from anybody who has any questions that I can help with, absolutely. We have a lot of recorded videos on our Pueblo County YouTube channel too, so check that out if you want to learn a little bit more.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure, as always, to work with you, Sherie. Thanks for bringing us such an interesting presentation today. Thank you, everyone who has joined us. We hope you continue to stay well. We do have a lot of upcoming events, some of which are partnered with CSU Extension as well. We do have a house plant event coming up in October that Sherie will be doing with us as well, so definitely check that out. But in the meantime, everyone be well, take care, and go Rams. Thanks again.